Hello, everybody. Welcome. Hello. It's so nice to see so many of you here and to hear such lively conversation happening. It's really exciting to see you here this evening. My name is Alex Elliott. I am the Senior Manager of Events and Engagement for CIIS Public Programs. And it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to On Integral Psychedelic Therapy. While we may all be joining from different places all over the world, there's you here in the audience with me tonight and also quite a few people watching online. As a representative of CIIS, I want to acknowledge our debt and gratitude to the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original peoples and continual caretakers of the San Francisco Peninsula. CIIS's campus is located on the traditional unceded lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone, which they call Yelamu. In the Ramaytush Ohlone language, Yelamu identifies both the people and the territory. Tonight's conversation is being live streamed to our online audience and also recorded for our podcast, which allows us to provide this content to a wider audience. If any of you want to watch it again or share it with your community, it will be available starting later tonight on the CIIS Public Programs YouTube channel. And we will also feature this on our podcast in the future with an accompanying transcript. You can find our podcast at ciispod.com or by searching CIIS Public Programs on your favorite podcast app. We are having a live Q&A tonight, and to make it accessible for everybody, online and in person, if you're watching online, there is a link underneath the video that you can click on and submit questions using the form. If you're here in the room, there are QR codes on the pillars here, and you can use your own device to post a question. It'll be included with all of the others. Or if you would rather write it down, you can come talk to us at the table and we can help you post it. We will try to get through as many questions as we have time for. I know there's going to be a lot. The online audience had already posted some before we started, so we'll try to get through as many as we can. For that online audience, chat is enabled for this event, but please note it is not moderated and the presenters obviously cannot see the chat. It's not required to fully experience the event, and if you feel that it is making your experience worse, please feel free to turn it off at any time. Now that I have all that business out of the way, let me introduce our presenters, Gisele, Genesee, and Jason, and then we will get right to their conversation. Jason Butler is a licensed clinical psychologist, a psychotherapist, and supervisor at Sage Integrative Health, and an associate professor in the Integral Counseling Psychology Department here at CIIS. He is deeply committed to broadening diversity, accessibility, and theoretical rigor in the field of psychedelic psychotherapy. He has written several published articles and chapters on the intersection of depth psychology and social justice. He is the author of a book entitled Archetypal Psychotherapy, The Clinical Legacy of James Hillman, and is the co-editor and co-author of the newly released book entitled Integral Psychedelic Therapy. Dr. Genesee Herzberg is a clinical psychologist from the California Bay Area with a doctorate from California Institute of Integral Studies and an undergraduate degree from Georgetown School of Foreign Service. She co-founded Sage Integrative Health, a holistic psychedelic clinic, and Alchemy Community Therapy Center, a nonprofit sliding scale psychedelic clinic and training program. She is a trainer and supervisor in ketamine-assisted therapy through Sage and MDMA-assisted therapy through MAPS. Genesee is an author and co-editor of the book Integral Psychedelic Therapy. She is passionate about making psychedelic medicine accessible to everyone who can benefit, developing innovative body-centered approaches to psychedelic healing, and promoting ethics and integrity as psychedelics go mainstream. Gisele Fernandes-Osterhold is the Director of Facilitation for Psychedelic Therapy at the TRPR Lab at UCSF and a mentor at the Center for Psychedelic Therapies and Research here at CIIS. A practicing psychotherapist for over 25 years, Gisele is specialized in the treatment of trauma using an integrative approach rooted in somatic, humanistic, existential, and transpersonal psychologies. She is dedicated to diversity and inclusion in her clinical, academic, and research engagements. And now it is my pleasure to turn it over to Gisele, Genesee, and Jason.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Namaste Hall. Welcome to CIIS. It's a pleasure to be here tonight with all of you, with Jason, with Genesee, and with all of those that are virtually joining us. Let's take a deep breath, everybody together. Let's arrive, find your sit bones, find your connection to your body. You've made it. Probably a lot of different activities and people and places that you've been involved with today, and now you're here. So enjoy this time together. We are here tonight for a treat. We're going to be talking about this book and diving into some of the deeper topics that this book brings about and are so pertinent to this field. I feel a lot of gratitude for being here at CIIS, as this is a home for me. It's a place that I came through grad school when I came from Brazil. I've taught here for 12 years and have been doing mostly online mentoring through the CPTR because I'm working with a group that is from different parts of the United States and the world that are interested in psychedelic assisted therapy. So I haven't been to campus in a long time. So it's wonderful to be here and to be here with you. Welcome. This room has hosted many important people and has a lot of wonderful, we come here today on the heels of those who came in before us. And so it's a good place to be. As we're getting started, I'll start with Jason. Would you want to tell us a little bit about your inspiration for this book?
Sure, thanks, Gisele. Welcome, everybody. So I'll start with the inspiration kind of in an immediate sense. Genesee and I were driving one day listening to Michael Pollan's book. And he was doing a pretty good exposition on the history of psychedelic therapy in the West. But what I found was really missing there was a deeper dive into the therapeutic methods that were really supporting psychedelic medicines, as well as the historical context that extends beyond just the kind of Western approach to psychedelic therapy. So we, Genesee and I in conversation, felt the call to really try to access the conversations that were happening amongst our peers, ketamine clinics and in the MDMA for PTSD research facilitated by the MAPS organization, really trying to ask the question, what therapeutic methods are going to really support the rolling out of psychedelic medicines to not only meet the client in the depth and breadth of experiences that are possible with psychedelics, but to also meet them in a way that accounts for social context and history. So as I come to that, I just want to situate myself as a person who is constructing this book and really recognize the history of white men, particularly, taking the field of psychedelic therapy in a particular direction without really acknowledging where it came from, at least not acknowledging it with much depth or sensitivity to the history of colonialism. So Genesee and I tried to really hold sensitivity to historical context throughout the whole construction of the book. And in doing so, my inspiration was to use the privileges afforded to me as a white man to lift up the voices of other people. So it became really important that this is an edited volume, to bring in voices that are typically not represented in the field, as well as perspectives and approaches that really haven't been talked about in the research literature so far.
Yeah, so Michael Pollan is brilliant, but he's a journalist.
That's
and
right.
this is about the mental health field. And so in this book, there's a great emphasis of a clinical approach, a book written by clinicians for clinicians, right? And you have a lot of people here, Genesee, that are collaborators. Would you want to say something about the process of bringing the people together, organizing the chapters, the topics? How was that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's true. This book is very much intended to go deeply into how does the therapy work. And we were finding that there wasn't enough out there up to this point that really deepened into therapeutic method and supported therapists in feeling well equipped to address the real subtleties of psychedelic work. It's a very specific and potentially vulnerable state that people go into and requires a certain set of skills. And so, yeah, we spent some time thinking about what are those skills? What do we feel is essential for a fully educated psychedelic therapist to know going into doing this work? So often people are trained in a pretty brief and superficial way and step in not fully prepared, and that's where harm happens. And so we spent a lot of time thinking through all of the various modalities, the history, as Jason mentioned, the origins of psychedelic medicine in indigenous cultures, and then brought together a group of our colleagues who were experts in these various areas. We actually initially envisioned both the book and a conference. We were planning to throw a conference of other psychedelic practitioners at Wilbur Hot Springs, a small group that was intended to be sort of a council or like a study group almost. And we were hoping to come together and really share our knowledge and expertise and learn from each other and develop the method. You know, Western psychedelic therapy is not that old at this point. While it's been practiced for hundreds of years in indigenous cultures, the way that it's being held in the Western world in the context of psychotherapy is relatively new. It's less than a century old. And so, yeah, it felt important to come together and really think about how can we refine and develop this work. And so, yeah, the conference got canceled because of COVID, so that didn't happen. And instead, we redirected our efforts towards writing the book. Simultaneously, we also we really value collaboration over competition. And so though I own a ketamine-assisted therapy clinic called Sage, and I know a number of folks who own and run other ketamine clinics who typically would be seen as competitors, but instead we all held a very collaborative attitude and came together to practice together and study together and learn together and support each other and develop the method. And it's really that spirit of collaboration over competition that kind of underlies this book, that lays as the foundation of the book.
Wonderful. And Richard Miller, who's not here tonight, it's also an editor in the book. And so Wilbur Hot Springs, that connection, and then the connection of the clinic. I just want to mention for those who don't know, today you're talking about Sage Integrative Health, but Sage Institute also came out as a vision of this collaboration of bringing people together to provide services of psychedelic assisted therapy using ketamine to a low-income community. And that's how we met. That's how we became connected, as I was part of that first cohort of supervisors. And it was a lovely project. And I would say a novel project, the pioneer clinic with that focus in the Bay Area that is today called Alchemy Institute.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for naming both of those things. First, want to honor Richard Miller, who was the owner of Wilbur Hot Springs at the time. And it was really at Wilbur Hot Springs where Jason and I started to envision into the book project, also into Sage Institute, which is now Alchemy, into the conference that never was to be. It's such a incredible place to support deepening in and visioning out into the better world that we all know is possible. And we met Richard there, and he became a part of that visioning. So yeah, definitely indebted to him. And then, yes, Sage Institute, now Alchemy, was an incredible grounds for exploration of the very model that we've been working on and articulating in the book. We got to really develop our training program there based on these various ideas, and learn with and from the psychotherapy interns that were part of that program. So a huge amount of gratitude to those interns as well, at least one of which is here today.
Yes, I see another one over there. So we'll get to more of that soon, but before we dive in, I want to start a little broader. Jason, you know, when we're thinking about psychedelic assisted therapy and the combination of the psychotherapy aspect of the work, as we hear so much focus on evidence-based, on cognitive approaches, ways in which symptom management has been a focus in the mental health field. And it might be effective for certain disorders and in certain conditions, but I'm wondering, how do you see the methodology and the approach of what this book brings as it compares to, let's say, cognitive-based therapies?
Yeah. You also mentioned evidence-based, and I just wanted to offer a little critique of what the field considers evidence. It's yet another example of hubris in our field to put such tight confines on what's considered evidence-based when there's been thousands of years of evidence collected by indigenous and pagan healers working with sacred medicine. So starting there, building off of that, I'll just offer first a little caveat to say, not all CBT, but generally speaking, cognitive behavioral and cognitive approaches work at from a perspective of materialism, that it's material causes that are going to be the curative factor. So there's the model derived from Western medicine, that it's the job of the therapist to apply an intervention the way a doctor would apply a pill or an injection. Those models are quite amenable to quantitative research methods, which is our favorite method for gathering knowledge. What that misses, though, and as you said, it can be effective for treating some disorders, but what that misses, by definition, is all of the complexities and contextual factors that any particular client is going to bring into any particular treatment. Moreover, it misses the contextual factors that the therapist, as a person in a body in this social world with historical conditions standing behind them and infusing the space, what all of those contextual factors do in a psychotherapy treatment. In fact, the research attempts to control for variables. It attempts to eliminate context. So now I'll contrast that with a holistic model, and there are many different versions of holistic models in psychotherapy. But this particular version that we're representing in the book exemplifies the kind of holistic sensibility of dropping really deeply into context, actually looking to context as the difference that makes all the difference. That we want to attend to the particularities that are present in the therapeutic relationship. Like what social identities does the client bring into the room? And the history of cultural experience that's just surrounding and infusing the space. Same thing can be said for the therapist. So that's why a liberation approach is important, which I'll speak to later. One that really accounts for historical and social context and holds a perspective that aims to undo oppressive practices that are going to infuse any method that doesn't critically think about liberation as a value in the psychotherapy. I'll just add from that you know, we want to account for social context. We want to account for the embodied somatic experience of the client. How are their bodies responding in the here and now to the treatment? And we want our therapists in general, to be very sensitive to that, to know how to track and respond to the here and now somatic experience that's happening in all the bodies in the room. Last thing I'll say, maybe, is that these psychedelic medicines unleash unprecedented access to transpersonal, numinous spiritual experiences in psychotherapy. That never before really have we had really democratized numinous spiritual transpersonal experience in a psychotherapy setting. So we need models that don't just focus on this kind of narrow band of human experience like cognition or behavior and reducing symptoms, but looking at the full phenomenology of the experience that comes through the lived experience of people taking these psychedelic medicines. And what has been demonstrated even through Western empirical research is that a majority of people have what's considered a mystical experience. And those mystical experiences correspond quite significantly with, you know, here it even fits the Western model, with the reduction of symptoms. So it's demonstrating something that I think we all know in our bones, and that Carl Jung wrote about quite eloquently, is that it's the experience of the numinous that is the healing factor here. It's the encounter with something much bigger than the ego. We can think about how that creates a sense of belonging, a sense of meaning and fulfillment in one's life. So we're extending the scope of the treatment far beyond this narrow channel of reducing symptoms to looking at what makes for a meaningful life. And in doing so, really getting at the root, not just of a psychological symptom, but of a whole cultural symptom, where systems of meaning have really crumbled. And we're all, I think, you know, scrounging to find what is a good life. Maybe that's a good pause moment.
Yeah, wonderful. So we're laying a foundation here for the conversation to further go into a more depth of an approach that is person-centered, that is rooted in culture, that includes the body, that takes into account the luminous, the mystical, the transpersonal, that is not prescribed and authoritative in symptom management, but rather invites the unfoldment of the human being in a relational frame that brings meaning. And I'm going to add not only to the individual, but to us as a community, as a group of people, because I think we are living times that this is, you know, what we're challenged to be doing. It's how do we heal collectively? So we'll unfold this a little more in a minute, but I'm going to turn into Genesee here, and still on that same line. So we're talking about an approach to psychedelic assisted therapy, as Jason is highlighting, the mystical, the transpersonal phenomena, that in which is a deeper types of processes that cannot be quantified and managed. How do you see the difference of this kind of approach, this kind of work, to, let's say, traditional psychotherapy? You know, we have a clear distinction there where one takes in medicine that alters your consciousness, but is there ways in which you see those parallels and where they meet and what is different?
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. So one important factor to take into account is that in a typical psychotherapy, say trauma-focused psychotherapy, where we're working with the client's trauma, it can take a very long time, months, even years, to start to access, to get the client to a safe enough place in which they can start to access their underlying trauma and process it. Where there are certain psychedelics, MDMA in particular, and we're finding that ketamine is quite effective for this as well, that can bring people quite quickly into their trauma. There are various mechanisms that enhance that effect, including the decreased blood flow to the amygdala, including the inhibition of the fight or flight response. And so suddenly people are connecting to early memories of their trauma, to repressed emotions, to dissociated self states. And that can open up a lot for the work. And it also requires a certain level of skill to be able to hold those things for the client in a safe way. In particular, one of the kind of orientations that's pretty consistently recommended in most psychedelic assisted therapies is a non-directive, or what MAPS is calling an inner directed approach. And so through that process, we're trusting that the client has some part of themselves, something inside themselves that has what it needs to heal, and that knows what to do when the obstacles to healing are removed. So if we imagine a safe set and setting, a carefully curated therapeutic container, and the support of a psychedelic medicine might do exactly what's needed to remove those obstacles, soften the defenses, etc., the therapist actually doesn't need to do that much, maybe a lot less than in a typical psychotherapy. Yeah, there's plenty of work to do in preparing the client for the session and in developing a safe relationship prior. But in the psychedelic therapy session itself, there's a lot of sitting back, a lot of really trusting that whatever arises for the client in the moment is important and is a good thing to stay close to and follow and listen to. So yeah, one big piece is actually, as Gisele put it in our conversation earlier, doing by doing less. And that can be a really hard thing to unlearn for many therapists. I mean, I think even just in traditional psychotherapy education, it's something that hopefully most therapists are unlearning just to sit with clients in the room. We so quickly want to fix. We feel people's pain and we want to do something about it. And there are certain methods that recommend doing something about it, but there are many others that have, suggest, and that I personally have found, it's much more effective to actually just meet people in their pain, to be with them in whatever experience they're in, and to legitimize their experience. So just in a traditional psychotherapy training, that learning is huge. And if you're there, then you're set up well to then learn about psychedelic therapy. But many stepping into psychedelic therapy training programs don't have that skill. They've done much more kind of CBT or other type of solution-focused treatments. And so they're needing to basically just unlearn and then relearn a new way of being with clients. So that's a big one. Another important piece here that I want to speak to is consent. So informed consent to treatment. It's something that in typical therapy can get just so easily brushed over. Maybe it's in your consent form, the client reads over it. Maybe you say a few things, like talk about confidentiality or something like that, but usually it doesn't take more than 5 minutes or so. Then you move on. In psychedelic therapy, it's a very different container that people are walking into, and a very different experience that people are walking into. The incredible vulnerability that psychedelics can induce creates a whole new level of need for care and for information and for support in terms of the client knowing what to expect and how to navigate those states, and developing a safe enough relationship with the therapist that they feel comfortable going into those vulnerable places. So that's a big piece of it. And then there also is, unfortunately, the potential for the kind of amplification of the power dynamic that's already there in a regular psychotherapy gets amplified with the psychedelic. The You know, the therapist is not only in the role of professional or expert, but they're also the only sober person in the room. And so there's a lot of potential for abuse of power, and therefore a lot of need to you know, do what you can to flatten the hierarchy, to speak to these issues so that the client better understands, you know, who the therapist is, you know, what type of power differentials are present in the room, and how they can start to feel more safe given the particular constellation of humans in the room. And then we start getting into things like touch, which is not typically a part of a psychotherapy treatment, although there are some methods out there, including Shirley Bardevere and Jackie Hull's relational somatic touch, that is demonstrating that touch can be super effective in regular therapy. But it's commonly integrated into psychedelic therapies for good reason, and there's a lot of risk there. And so an elaborate conversation around consent for touch is also an essential part of this work. I guess the last piece that I'll speak to briefly is just, and relatedly, is the extent to which psychedelics have the potential to increase the intimacy in the therapeutic relationship, to activate attachment systems, to basically kind of bring the therapist and client closer. And given that, it's really important that the therapist have a solid understanding of relational therapy, a solid understanding of how to work with the dynamics between client and therapist, the transference, the countertransference, the subtle dynamics that most of us can just easily miss if we're not paying attention. I'll talk more about this later, but just kind of adding that I feel that that is so core to stepping into doing this work.
Okay, so you've named a stance of non-directive stance, one that is valuing the inner healing intelligence of the client. You've named working with touch. You've named working with attachment. You've named transference and countertransference as being highlighted, amplified in psychedelic assisted therapy, and bringing in the attention to ethics and training and depth of understanding of the therapist to these phenomena, and depth of training onto how to navigate this potentially vulnerable space that people get into. Now, the question goes for both of you. How do you see, with now ketamine clinics all over the country, the MDMA in the heels of approval, psilocybin-assisted therapy in Oregon, in Washington, and hopefully soon around here too, as psychedelic therapies become more widely available, what are the challenges that you see in a model like this, or for this kind of treatment to be available, considering all these factors?
It's a really big question. Genesee already touched on some, but I'll just elaborate. You can see from what she just named that there is a depth of training that's required. And I think Genesee will speak to this more too, but what we see is there's a continuous tension between the depth of training required for a professional to really hold this work and accessibility. And so it's a dialectic that doesn't have a clear black and white answer. I'm all for making these treatments as accessible as possible, but to what degree do we open access and decrease safety? So that's a fundamental challenge and question that I think is a living question for all of us trying to roll these medicines out in a psychotherapy setting. Genesee also touched on the potential for abuses of power. We're already seeing that. It's the same old human problems are showing up in psychedelic therapy, where people abuse people in vulnerable states. And so ethics is a really important challenge. What are the ethics of being with somebody in the sensitive nature of a psychedelic state? Another piece that I'll say, anecdotally, and even through Genesee's dissertation research, we've noticed that there's a challenge around the appropriate level of holding from an attachment relational perspective. These medicines, and I'll name MDMA particularly, let's focus on MDMA, flood the body psyche with our attachment system, flood the body with oxytocin and dopamine and serotonin, and more experientially, open our hearts and create very deep, intimate connections, possibly. If that is not held with just exquisite sensitivity for the particular attachment needs of the client, then it's bound to turn from a healing opportunity into an opportunity to injure, to harm the client. And as Genesee's example will point to later, I think, we're seeing this both from folks pursuing these treatments in underground contexts, as well as the kind of short-term models in ketamine clinics that are really looking to reduce cost by having a non-therapist do the sitting, or no therapist at all. But where's the client left in that? You know, they're opened up in these profoundly significant ways, but then who's there to hold them? And who falls through the cracks? So pass over to Genesee.
Yeah, so you're highlighting some of the challenges on a clinical sense, on a clinical arena, right? The vulnerability of the client, that opportunity to have a reparative experience with that openness, and being perhaps left in that open state, in that vulnerable state, not held in a way that would support their psychedelic experience and their healing ultimately. You're talking about abuse of power, you're talking about ethical issues. How about capitalist forces? How about folks who are not into the mental health field as a commitment to healing themselves and others, but are very interested in the field? There's a lot of them. Would you want to say something about that?
Yeah, there sure are, more and more. It's becoming a huge industry at this point, and it's only going to keep growing. Yeah, I have a lot of concern, having been in this field for, I don't know, over a decade now, and just seen the incredible growth and evolution, which in some ways is exciting and in other ways is really scary. I do wonder what's going to happen next, how this is all going to unfold and evolve. And one of the things that concerns me is what I might call the myth of the magic pill. So while Michael Pollan's book was great in getting the word out there about psychedelic therapy and really helping it to become mainstream, it also left a number of people believing that they could go find a psychedelic guide, have one psychedelic experience, and be cured for life. And we got so many calls in the years after that at Sage, at our clinic, of people looking for that magic cure, basically. And so a lot of our work then consisted of talking people down, psychoeducation, letting them know that yes, these medicines can support you and can have profound effects and can expedite the therapeutic process and deepen the therapeutic process. But it's not very often that one experience is going to completely heal whatever it is that you're coming in with. Very often it involves an ongoing therapeutic relationship to support the psychedelic work that you're doing. And very often it requires a number of psychedelic therapy treatments over time. And in my mind, there is no final magically healed place that we arrive. We're all working over the course of our lives to heal. And there certainly are, incredible leaps and bounds that we can make in terms of our health and well-being. And also, there's no arrival place. So unfortunately, though, with that myth, there are some clinics like us that are talking people down and trying to provide what we see as a realistic picture of what this work would look like. And then there are other companies that are really trying to jump on that and be like, look, come get your, 1 or 2 sessions and you'll be good to go. Or even, and also like some of this is in an effort to bring the costs down. But like Jason was saying, there are other companies that are taking the therapist out of the therapy. So, they're sending a lot of ketamine to people's houses, and maybe there's a little bit of guidance around how to use that ketamine, but also a lot of space for people to abuse it or have harmful or scary experiences or all kinds of things. So yeah, and I think some of these offerings are helpful for some people. So I'm not against any of the particular organizations or offerings or companies that are out there per se. Some of them rub me more the wrong way than others, particularly those that are trying to patent really basic therapeutic techniques like, holding someone's hand or setting up a nice comfy room. I'm alluding to Compass, and there was a whole thing around this in the past for those who may have heard about it. But beyond that, some companies like Mind Bloom who are sending, ketamine to people's homes, I think that does help some people who are maybe a little bit more kind of functional and able to care for themselves and able to be thoughtful about how much and when and what kind of support they need, etc. But I do get concerned about just the kinds of harms that can evolve there when there's not proper therapeutic holding, especially for people who have a lot of trauma. And then the other thing that I'll speak to, I mean, I have plenty of concerns about where the field is going right now, but I'm just going to build on what Jason said about access. Like, as it is now, in order to cover the cost of the medicine and also cover the cost of the therapy, these treatments are not cheap. And it's only a very limited number of people that can access them and afford them. And there are a number of different organizations looking at how do we address this, including Alchemy Community Therapy Center that Jason and I co-founded and Gisele supervised at. But there's still no obvious solution. Health insurance coverage would be a huge support in that area. We're not quite there yet. Government grants, that kind of thing, but it's still a problem that needs to be solved. And it's an issue on both a financial level and also on a cultural level. So at least 5 years ago, if you look around any room of any event on psychedelics, it would probably be about 95% white. That's changed over time, thank goodness. Just even in the past 5 years, I've seen that shift dramatically as more and more people speak to this issue, but for very good reasons, ranging from wealth privilege to the drug war to the impact of the drug war on communities of color in particular, and attitudes that then created around the understandable fears and hesitations around drug use. In addition to just kind of the communities who traditionally worked with psychedelics, there was a pretty sharp division in terms of who was using psychedelics and who wasn't, and who was stepping into the field to, talk about psychedelics at conferences and train on psychedelics and become psychedelic therapists and clients. So I'm seeing some really incredible initiatives to change that, and that's exciting, but we also have a long way to go there.
Thank you. A little bit more on challenges?
Yeah, sure.
I have a few to throw in the pot.
Please do.
Well, I can relate, with the expectation being in research at UCSF and participants watching Netflix documentaries and reading peer-reviewed journals or reading books and coming in with an expectation that is going to deliver what they want. And it's 1, 2 sessions, sometimes 3, sometimes 4. And some people, yes, they are able to make that deeper connection inside of themselves, that something shifts in the quality, in the way they relate to themselves, to their narratives, to ways in which they see the world and themselves, but not everybody. And then there's also, what do you do with that? So even for those who have a profound experience and have that immediate relief of a new perspective, of a new narrative, how to sustain that and to put that into practice in a way that is not going to just go back to psychedelics over and over again, because that would be actually the opposite of what we were trying to, in the first place, do, which is to reconnect with something inside and then live from a different place. And if you're, again, placing it outside, it defeats the purpose. And so that's one aspect. On training aspect, I feel sometimes also challenged by people who are coming into the field and want to make their cognitive-based frames fit with psychedelics when they themselves have not had the opportunity to commune and understand what psychedelics can do to the psyche. And I guess I'm a little biased here, but would love to hear from you in terms of how important is it to understand the phenomena of psychedelics in order to design treatment models, research pilots, clinics, and roll out on a larger scale ways that are sustainable, that are safe, and that are in alignment with what psychedelic therapies can do?
Great question. Well, I'm obviously going to be coming from my particular bias. And this is a controversial question. And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer. But I will say that I think it's tremendously important that anyone offering these medicines have their own direct experience with the medicine that they're serving. The phenomenology, as you said, the experience of what it's like to take psychedelics it's a trip. It's non-ordinary. So to take an ordinary methodology and try to apply it to meet the non-ordinary states that psychedelics generate is like trying to take a square and fit it in a round hole. It's at best going to miss a tremendous amount of the phenomena that are at play. And at worst, it's going to harm people. Misattunement hurts. Ignoring certain aspects that are often the most meaningful parts of the experience hurts people. So that's my opinion about that.
I'll just add, I'm right there with you, Jason. And I think having spoken from that perspective for a while, I've also heard others speak up in response and say, well, there are some people with medical issues, for example, who aren't then able to take a psychedelic for one reason or another. And I think in those circumstances, there are a variety of ways to access altered states of consciousness, not just through ingesting something. So whether it's holotropic breath work, I mean, I've had some of my most profound psychedelic experiences just by breathing. So yeah, holotropic breath work is a big one. Shamanic drumming, music can help one enter all on its own into a deeply trance state. Eric Sinkenecht writes about that beautifully in our book. So yeah, lots of different ways to get there, but certainly necessary, I think, for people to have some familiarity with those states. Yeah. And then the other thing I'll say is I do get concerned when people come out of other fields, get excited about this field, and suddenly want to jump in and create training programs and create businesses, et cetera. Though we're a small community, there are many, many elders and people more where we're at and below who've been doing this work for a long time. And I really hope that those who had their one mushroom trip and got excited and want to start a company and have the resources for it will seek out people who've been deeply immersed in the field and can inform the process from a place of deep knowing and understanding.
Yeah, so it's not that you have to necessarily have had psychedelic experience, but it's an honoring of a deeper space and of a kind of openness that has to be respected and acknowledged to be worked with. Exactly.
I just want to say I fully agree with that.
Yes. So, and the book is called Integral Psychedelic Therapy. And we are here at the California Institute for Integral Studies, and CIIS has a lineage that comes from India with Sri Aurobindo. We also know integral from Ken Wilber. What do you mean by integral in this book?
Yeah, I'm not going to wax philosophical about all the history of integral and what it means. It's really quite simple. What we mean by that is an attempt to get at wholeness. It's synonymous with holistic. So we're really just trying to create a therapeutic methodology that meets people in their wholeness and helps people reestablish wholeness after, finding fragmentation and various ways fragmentation happens, largely through cultural, acute, and developmental trauma. So our particular version of integral, which I think we'll have a little time to flesh out, is just one version of integral. And the way that we did that was looking at somatic methodologies to really try to meet people in their embodied experience and the intelligence of the body, the way the body knows how to heal when the conditions are right. We brought in a depth transpersonal perspective to meet people in the very rich, imaginal, symbolic material that these medicines consistently generate and the numinous mystical experiences that I was referencing earlier. We bring in a liberation social justice perspective because we're all situated in history and a social context. And so often the symptoms, the presenting issues that people show up with can be tracked back to cultural oppression and the inequitable systems that really harm people. So we wanted a model that holds that as an integral component. And lastly, as Genesee was mentioning, we bring in a relational perspective because psychedelics amplify the relational field. I'll leave that for Genesee to speak to, but those are the components that we hold as integral to a robust model for psychedelic therapy.
Great. So let's shine some light into those aspects and some of the chapters in the book. So let's start with you with the liberation approach and some of the social justice focus that situates the therapist, situates the client, situates the work with the medicine as it has been used for thousands of years before by different people in different parts of the world. What would you like to share about what's in the book on that front?
Sure, yeah. So just want to shout out to Danielle Herrera and Emma Knighton, who really focused their chapters really directly on kind of social justice considerations. Danielle Herrera's chapter is called Decolonizing Psychedelic Therapy. And Emma Knighton is writing about consent, and in writing about consent, is writing about power and writing about intersectionality and the way power shows up in these kind of intersectional matrix, the way our intersectional identities interact with the client's intersectional identities and create power dynamics in the room. So a liberation approach, one aspect of this, one facet that Danielle touches on beautifully, is to hold a critical analysis of history, to look at, as Genesee mentioned earlier, the history that stands behind and is infusing the field in the therapeutic space. So for example, let's name the history of medical racism, the history of Black and Brown people being experimented on in ways that are entirely unethical and harmful. And so when a person from a marginalized community, one other piece, in terms of critical historical analysis, let's look at LGBTQ populations that have not just been harmed by the Western medical world as a whole, but by psychedelic therapy particularly. Check out Queering Psychedelics, the edited volume that was published by Shukruna. There's a beautiful chapter by Alex Belzler who highlights the way conversion therapy was used by prominent psychedelic researchers. Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, all have historical records of using psychedelics to try to convert people from their queer sexuality, from being gay, lesbian, bisexual, to being heterosexual. So that's part of the dark history that one needs to know deeply when one's sitting and offering psychedelic therapy, because your clients are impacted by that. So it's that kind of seeing, not just seeing the person in front of you, but seeing the history that stands behind them and that stands behind us, and really being sensitive to that and being able to name when those dynamics might be at play, when the fear of being harmed in similar ways might be at play and impacting the sense of safety in the room. And not just that, but also, can we create opportunities to heal those cultural traumas by really listening deeply? So that's one aspect, is having that historical critical analysis, and then also just knowing how you may be experienced by the client. You know, for me, for example, being a white man, like I really want to be sensitive to how my clients may have been harmed by other white men, and how the cultural transference, the way in which just how I present is going to impact the way the client feels towards me. So that's a short rendition of a kind of liberation social justice approach.
Yeah, thank you. Being in the mental health field, standing in that lineage, and at the same time being part of the medical field that carries all this luggage, right? So it's that paradox there. So the importance of being trained and knowing all of this, and then also undoing and unlearning. It's a very profound process. And Genesee, in regards to some of the chapters of the book, Jason mentioned some of them also diving into more somatic, body-oriented, the use of touch and ethics, which you already mentioned here tonight. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? And how is that being highlighted in the book?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, psychedelics, through a variety of different changes in the body and brain, inhibit the fight or flight response, they soften the defenses, they increase connectivity between different parts of the brain, and that allows us to more easily access our trauma, more easily access our emotional experience, often repressed emotions or emotions that are harder to access otherwise, and also to more easily access our bodies and the ways that trauma is held in our bodies. One of the ways that I think about ketamine is that it turns down the volume, at least at lower doses, it turns down the volume on emotional and physical pain, which can allow us to actually feel pain that otherwise has been dissociated. So thanks to all of those effects, it's incredibly important that the therapist have the capacity to attune to the client on a somatic bodily level. And both Veronica Gold, who I'm seeing over there, and Jackie Hull, who I'm seeing over here, go into these topics in great depth, talking about how the body responds to and holds trauma, and also how we can start to drop into a subtler mode of sensing, in which we can start to pick up on where the client is holding their trauma in their body, start tracking sort of certain movements or expressions that might be indicating things happening for them that we might not typically notice or pick up on, and also start to bring words to these things as they're showing up, help the client find mindfulness around these ways of being, and then help them to work with them. And that can happen in a variety of different ways. But both of these chapters actually emphasize the ways in which touch can be incredibly supportive for helping people to move with the trauma that gets stuck in the body. And that, of course, needs to happen with a lot of care. As we spoke about before, there's incredible potential for boundary violations if we're not careful, if we don't have very clear conversations about consent early on and ongoingly. But if it's done well, touch and somatic attention to the body can start to unleash these ways that the body holds trauma through a full-bodied experiencing of the trauma, of the emotions. And then an expression could be through crying or shaking or kicking or just laughing, even all kinds of different ways that trauma can move through. And then on a subtler level, there can also be a sort of just gentle softening that comes from the slow opening to the love that's there. This is something that Jackie and Shirley really emphasize in their relational somatic approach, which involves just gently being present with the clients, meeting them in their nourishment barriers, meeting them in the parts, their protectors that aren't willing to let others in because it's too scary, they don't trust, and just staying with that until those parts soften, or maybe they don't soften, and that's okay too, but just a real patience and love and care, and the ways in which that therapeutic relationship and connection and patience and consistency can lead to significant change, and the client can really take in those experiences under the influence of a medicine that's opened them up to receive.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that, the way we practice at UCSF is to practice touch before they take the medicine. And so people in their ordinary consciousness with their protectors in place, and so they can navigate the degree of intimacy and the degree of touch that feels good to them, and then have language for it, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, of when they do want the touch, when they do want the support, and then when they don't want it anymore. And so we do that. I train my team, and we do that in the prep sessions, and participants very quickly turn their attention to, oh, I can ask for that. And it's so interesting to see how the protection and the vulnerability is, sometimes it's so hard to say, Kate, can you come sit close to me? Can you hold my hand? In ordinary consciousness, a lot of people have, it's a difficult thing to do. So normalizing that, practicing that with mindfulness, so that when they are in an altered state, they know what they have agreed to and how they want to be supported and what feels right for them, and how they would go about asking for that, and how they would go about saying, I don't want it anymore. And it works really well.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, Emma Knighton's chapter on consent, she presents a kink-informed model for consent for psychedelic therapy, naming the fact that the kink and BDSM communities have had to think about this more than just about any community out there. And they've figured it out in a way that most haven't, including the psychedelic field. And so she's applying what she's learned in those communities to psychedelics, and lays out super helpful and practical guidelines to do exactly what Gisele is describing here. And the one thing I'll add is she emphasizes that through most of our education and growing up, we don't learn how to even identify our yeses and our nos, much less say them out loud. So, so often we're taught to bypass the part of us that doesn't want touch. How many people just go up to a baby and kiss them on the cheek? The consent doesn't exist in a way when we're children in this culture. And so it's a steep learning curve for many of us to learn to find our yeses and our nos in our body, and then feel confident enough to say them out loud. So yeah, Emma also provides a really helpful exercise around how to help people do that, which she feels you can't even move into a conversation around consent until you see that people can actively say an embodied yes and an embodied no.
Yes, and sometimes they cannot say that yet because that's part of their process. And then it's up to us as therapists to pay attention into the nonverbal cues that they're giving, because they're contracting, they are uncomfortable, and so we make contact with that and help them gain that access to their voices and their abilities to say yes or no.
So important to be tracking those things. They're so easy to miss.
Yeah. And, you know, that's the liberation approach, the social justice approach, the somatic approach. How about the transpersonal aspect, Jason? How is that important in this work, and how is the book bringing that about?
Yeah, you got a good smile from me because this is where a lot of my heart lives. I wanted to actually share the words of a client here. I'll be brief because we need to go to Q&A. But as I was mentioning earlier, psychedelics really open up so much access to the deep psyche, and it's really a depth transpersonal approach that has been carefully constructed to meet the client in that kind of experience. So this client has given me permission. This was a client that I saw for ketamine-assisted therapy, and he's given me permission to share his words. He came in as an artist really struggling with creativity, to express his creativity freely in the world, and struggling with a tremendous amount of blocked grief from seeing a number of his artist friends perish, really, to die. So he was struggling with pretty significant depression. In our preparation session, I asked him, what's the image of your struggle right now? And he sits back, he slows down, and he lets his psyche speak. What his psyche said is the image was a sealed up tree, all the leaves folding inward toward itself, trapping the birds within the tree, muting their song, killing the life inside. What a poignant image of what was happening at a soul level. We get to the ketamine session, and his intention was, I don't need to turn away from people. It's time to face the world again. I want to create a life that's more engaged. I want to be part of the world of people, not run away. He goes inward for the ketamine session and has eye shades on and following the music. When he comes out about 2 hours later, he says the following. He described an experience of becoming, quote, a field of grass in the bright sun, blown by the wind, releasing seed into the wind. He added, I feel my ripeness as though I was an egg that cracked. I'm ready to scatter and disseminate, propagate, let things go. I feel like the germ, small and bent, the introverted part of the wheat seed, a coiled potency of structures folded inwards, waiting for a chance to open. It goes like this, the sun's heat makes me open. My palms are golden with sun. It opens me, unfolds me. I just want to pass along something good. It goes like this, like a warm cup of tea to you. That's a seed. You get chills reading that. So what we see here is a movement from this image of constriction, of life dying inside him, his creative spark, like the bird's song, being trapped by these defensive barriers that he was feeling, unmourned grief, and his own persecutory inner voice, to a quality of deep expansion. The image says it perfectly. His seed is ready. I mean, what kind of perfect image of fertile creativity moving out into the world, and seed blowing in the wind. So we have here now a kind of tension between opposites of his symptoms as constriction, and the expansive state bringing a free-flowing expansion of his creativity out into the world. So then came the integration process of holding the tension of these two images and letting the medicine of that expansive state really work on his pattern of contraction.
Beautiful. So bringing imagery, the symbolic, the archetypes, to inform the psyche and inform the process. Anything that you wanted to highlight, Genesee, about the relational frame that the book addresses?
Also, we're of time, but this was where I wanted to bring in a case as well. So maybe I'll just do that somewhat quickly. This is the case that we describe in the book. It's a woman who I interviewed for my dissertation, who gave me permission to talk about her in the book and in my dissertation as well, although her name is anonymized. But basically, she was in a psychotherapy with someone for about a year, just regular psychotherapy, and she was running into blocks, just feeling like she couldn't access her underlying trauma. This is someone who had been abandoned by her mother at 2 years old and lived primarily with her father after that. And about a year into the treatment, maybe a few months short of a year into the treatment, the psychotherapist mentioned that she did MDMA work, and did the client want to participate? The client was very excited about this and thought it could help her to open things up and move things along. There was also an interesting contextual factor, which was that the therapist was planning to move out of the country within the next, I believe it was 4 months. And so they would be ending their treatment at that time. So they go ahead and decide to move into the MDMA work. They spend some time preparing, and they finally schedule their MDMA session. The MDMA session, I believe, is maybe a month or so before the therapist's departure date. And in the session, what the client reported is that she found herself just kind of frolicking around the room, throwing scarves, playing. She'd have these moments of suddenly going inward, like pulling the blankets over her, and then having memories come up of her mother. And in fact, she had one very profound vision of being in her mother's stomach in utero, and her mother saying, I'm not going to stick around for very long. I'm sorry about that. And she cried a little bit, and then she came out and she went to tell her therapist, but she felt like her therapist just wasn't very interested. She didn't feel connected to the therapist, so she ended up going off and doing her own thing, dancing to music, and that was kind of the extent of this session, the MDMA session. She reported to me as I interviewed her that she felt profoundly disappointed by the experience and by the therapist, and that she also, they didn't talk about what had happened in the integration sessions. So they, kind of just talked about, kind of wrapped things up in their work and said goodbye, and that was it. The client went on to be depressed for a full year after the session. Like she had been depressed prior, but her depression it intensified quite a bit. And so she was more depressed than she had been prior. That lasted for about a year. And that was her experience. And so when we think back on that from a relational perspective, we can identify all of these places where the therapist may have missed something. For one, when you're thinking relationally, when you're thinking psychodynamically, you're thinking about what are some of the early patterns that might be replaying themselves here. So like, oh, this woman was abandoned by her mother, and now we have a year-long relationship, and I'm about to leave her after entering into a deeply vulnerable and potentially deeply vulnerable and connected place. That was never mentioned. And then this rupture of feeling like the therapist was bored or disinterested. The client didn't bring that up. She felt bad. She didn't want to hurt her. And the therapist wasn't tending to what we call the relational field. So the subtle energetics between therapist and client, the subtle relational dynamics, the subtle emotions. That's not our term, by the way, but we use it in the book. So had she been tending to the relational field, she would have picked up on like, there's something happening for this client, that she's really keeping her distance, that she's coming up to share about something, but not really going deep. Like, what's happening here? And ideally, the therapist would have, if not in the MDMA session, in an integration session, said like, I noticed that there was some distance between us, or that I didn't feel that connected to you in the session. I wonder what was happening there. And maybe she would have even, made some space to hear from the client. She might have even disclosed something about herself, like she was feeling tired that day. I'm sorry. And just really opened up a real conversation between the two of them, a relational negotiation to help them start to understand what was happening for both of them and find some repair through that rupture. Rupture is not an inherent problem in relationships and in the therapy if it can be repaired. In fact, it can be something that leads to greater intimacy. It can lead to healing and reparative emotional experiences if the therapist is able to bring it into the conversation and tend to it with compassion and humility and accountability, willingness to be wrong. So yeah, that's a big piece. The relational chapter is the longest chapter in the book. Jason and I just couldn't stop writing and didn't know what to cut out. And so it's got a lot in there. But there's a lot to say on the topic. And yeah, that's just a little piece of it for you.
It's a wonderful chapter. I hope that folks get the book and get to read it all. We could sit all night under this full moon by the fire and talk about all the things that happened there. But for the sake of time, I want to begin to my last question to both of you, and then I'm going to open up for the questions of the audience. So where are you at today? So there was the clinic, there was the book, and then what's feeding your fire these days? Want to share a little bit about that?
I can start. Yeah, and I also just wanted to acknowledge that we didn't cover maybe half of the chapters in this book. There's so much good stuff in here. All of our authors wrote really brilliant pieces covering essential topics, including internal family systems and music and integration and mystical states, and group therapy. So yeah, lots here that we didn't get to touch on. In terms of next projects, one of them relatedly is that we're excited to offer a training, a psychedelic therapy training that's really inspired by the book. And so we'll be going through the chapters one by one and digging into each of these topics. And in addition to some others that we feel are essential. And then we'll have a second component that involves kind of a practical application of what we're talking about through ketamine-assisted therapy. So you'll learn the kind of theoretical aspects, and then you'll learn how to do ketamine-assisted therapy, and then you'll get to practice them. And we'll have lots of role plays and lots of kind of feedback with Jason and I will both be teaching along with some other really excellent therapists at Sage. So yeah, we're excited to launch that. Back there, we have a table for Sage Integrative Health. And if you're interested, you can just put your name on our email list and you'll get more information about it. The plan is to launch it sometime in the late summer or early fall. So yeah, that's the biggest one. I'm speaking at a couple conferences coming up. There's a conference at Harvard on psychedelics, contrasting visions, and all talking about access there and kind of looking at what I learned from co-founding an accessible psychedelic therapy clinic. And then at Shakruna's Psychedelic Culture Conference, I'll be talking there on ethics and consent and touch. So yeah, both topics that I'm real passionate about.
Wonderful. And you?
No, I really like relaxing in hammocks. I'll be participating in that training Genesee was just mentioning. I'm also on the committee here at CIIS looking at how to expand our offerings around psychedelic psychotherapy at the university. And lastly, Genesee mentioned we couldn't stop writing. We actually have about 200 pages of unpublished material that we couldn't fit in this book. So one of these days we'll weave that all together and put out a second book, kind of creating foundations for this practice to support the special topics that were represented in the book.
Kind of like a handbook of psychedelic therapy. Something like that.
Wonderful. I'm so glad to hear about the committee. I remember how much I had to fight It took about 2 years to get approval from the department to be able to teach psychedelic assisted therapy in ICP, in integral counseling psychology. So
Thank you.
it was 12 of us, and I only had 2 people who were supportive of me doing that. All the others were like, what is that? And no, we shouldn't. The students shouldn't learn about that. And so the field is evolving very quickly. So I'm very pleased to hear that not only you have been taking on this class, but it's also more involved in even expanding that. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So how about that iPad? Let's see what we have here in the room, what you guys are interested. Thank you for being such a lovely audience. I've felt you holding and paying attention. And so let's see. I'm wondering if you can speak to relationships of reciprocity with Indigenous communities who have stewarded these medicines for countless generations, especially during a phase in the exponential growth of psychedelics in clinical setting. How can reciprocity, honoring cultures and traditions, not just acknowledgement, but with action, how can this be addressed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. So one thing that people should know about is the Sogorea Land Trust. It's a way to give back. It's a voluntary tax that people can pay for this area to rematriate this land to prevent sacred sites from continuing to be desecrated by parking lots and such. So that's one direct action. I'll also give a shout out to the Circle of Sacred Nature, which does a lot of activism with the lineage that they've drawn from, the kind of ayahuasca medicine lineage, bringing material support to the indigenous communities that have taught and supported the facilitators in that church. Big shout out to Selena and Brian Anderson.
And maybe just a final one, Bia Labate, who created Shakruna, also founded what I believe is called the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative. And it's a project that looks to specifically raise funds from those who would like to contribute and then distribute it to Indigenous communities that they feel need it the most. And yeah.
Yeah, and I think if you have benefited from medicine work from Indigenous communities, that you hold that with a lot of respect, and that you don't take the traditions that are not yours and try to reciprocate them, that you don't water down traditions or teachings by thinking that they belong to you and you can carry them. Yeah, those are a few things that come to mind as well. Question from Marnie. With this growing field, my question focuses on ethics and how to ensure we refer a client to someone trained properly. I see plant medicine is readily available, and yet there's no way to tell if facilitators have training, especially outside of the US, as I am in Southeast Asia.
Well, I can speak to, this is not international, but there are efforts within the states to build a credentialing board, basically, that will credential psychedelic therapy practitioners. We're not there yet. It's not ready to go yet, but that will be one way, similar to, you know, the APA or the Board of Behavioral Sciences that accredits psychotherapists. It would accredit psychedelic therapists. And there's still questions around who qualifies as a psychedelic therapist. Do they need to be a licensed practitioner or not? There are certainly many, many people who do not have licenses and perhaps don't have the funds to obtain the degrees necessary to get the licenses, but who have tremendous experience and skill. So yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important question. I don't have a solid answer for it. It's one of those places where the field is still developing and a question we haven't figured out yet as a community. But, you know, generally really trying to create a network of others who are plugged into the field and who can provide solid resources. Another way could be to actually interview the practitioner and to ask them some big questions around how they do the work, you know, how they think about some of these different issues that we were just talking about, what their training entailed, how how many sessions have they done? How long have they been doing the work, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to add?
I was going to say that. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and I also think that here the question highlights two different contexts. One is seeing a therapist that has formal training, and the other is doing medicine plant, which would be under a spiritual shamanic tradition. And so I think that for somebody engaging in either context, it's important to know that those are two very different contexts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if you're looking to work with a practitioner who's working within a shamanic tradition, you'd really want to be looking there at who were their teachers, what lineage have they practiced under, were they blessed to be doing this work by their elders, how do they continue to carry those traditions forward, how do they relate to reciprocity, how do they give back,
Where do they get their medicine?
Yeah.
Another question. Do you envision graduate programs being created to specifically train psychedelic therapists? Yes, I do. Until then, what programs and licenses allow for training and practice as psychedelic therapists for those who don't already hold a license?
Can you repeat the last part?
Yeah, so until then, what kind of training and practice would they engage in?
Yeah, I kind of wiggled at that because the department that Gisele used to teach in and the department that I currently teach in, integral counseling psychology here at CIIS, I think is a fantastic preparation for practicing psychedelic therapy. And I'm not just saying that because I work there.
I believe Naropa has a program now. I'm not sure if they're looking for kind of programs within institutions that teach about psychedelic medicine or more how to get additional training. There are a ton of psychedelic therapy trainings out there at this point.
Polaris Insight Center is one right here in San Francisco that offers a number of modules in ketamine-assisted therapy, which is directly applicable to providing a number of different medicines.
Mm-hmm. And then in preparing to set a psychedelic medicine session, how important is the involvement of the client in co-creating the space and music that will be potentially listened to? How realistic is the client's participation considering time constraints?
Yeah, that's an aspect we didn't speak to, but I think is very important. So in addition to preparing the client for what to expect, to learning about the client's trauma or whatever it is they're coming to work with, to cultivating the therapeutic relationship, you're also really preparing together, you're co-creating the container in which the psychedelic work will happen. And so that involves everything from, how does it feel to be in this room? Is there anything you want to change? Do you want to bring anything that might make it feel better? Do you want to take anything away that might make it feel more comfortable? Do you want to build some kind of, special space and bring significant objects like an altar or something else? Do we want flowers in the room? And then there's also the music. Typically, how I approach that is to ask people what they absolutely don't like and also what their musical preferences are. The recommendation that I was trained around is to create the playlist for the client rather than having them bring their own music, because music that they know well can lead to kind of the same neural pathways being stimulated, where novel music can open up novel neural pathways. And, some people go about that in different ways. Some clients really want to bring their own music and it works out great. Definitely, if they want to bring a song or two that they love and add that to the playlist, that works. And it's always sort of a feedback process. So we'll have a playlist and hear what they thought about it and kind of continue to build it from there. And then we also like to talk about co-created ritual, client-centered co-created ritual. There's an incredible chapter in our book on that by Jason's sister, Shannon Butler, and Kamara Rajbari. And the two of them do a really beautiful job of going into that topic in depth. I'll just say here that if, we want to be very careful not to bring in spiritual or religious practices that the client is not going to feel comfortable with, or that you don't have a strong personal relationship to. And so typically I'll, put it out there. Are you interested in co-creating some kind of ritual to step into the psychedelic work? Here are some things that people sometimes like to do, like light a candle or set an intention or pull a card or meditate or pray. And I'll just go over a whole list and we'll see what they're oriented to. Some people are like, hell yeah, and they want to do a whole thing. And other people are like, saying my intention out loud sounds nice. So I really follow their lead there and don't want to impose any of my kind of spiritual beliefs or practices onto their experience.
Mm-hmm. The other question is, how do you think the separation of medication administration from the therapy session would affect the therapist-client relationship? For example, the therapist would wait in one room and the patient would be administered the medication by another person outside that room.
It's not how we do it. Yeah, so it really depends on the medication. For ketamine specifically, there's a variety of different routes of administration. One of the routes is through lozenges, where the client actually holds their own medication, so they bring it into the room with them, and so they self-administer. If they're undergoing an intramuscular route of administration with ketamine, then we have the provider, a medical practitioner like a RN, an NP, or a medical doctor come into the room with the therapist there. And it's pretty seamless, not quite a disruption, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And I would say in research settings, we're also therapists with the participant in the room, and they take the medicine themselves. And so I don't know what the question here refers to, what kind of setting they have been exposed to where that is not done together.
My immediate impulse is I wouldn't recommend that, but I may need to know more.
Yeah. And another question is, how can I connect and collaborate with other psychedelic therapists?
Great. Yeah. There's the San Francisco Psychedelic Society, and there's a number of analog societies in all kinds of different regions, probably globally. There's a community of practitioners that are associated with the MAPS MDMA for PTSD training. There's an alumni association or alumni gatherings that people have formed spontaneously. Pass over to Genesee as well.
Come to events like this. Also do a psychedelic therapy training. That's where you're going to find the most condensed number of therapists, and often after those trainings you develop community there, and then you can there are listservs you can stay on afterwards to stay connected. So I would say that's probably by far the best way, but just go to psychedelic events. Like that's how I started getting plugged in 15 years ago, and it's so many people that are excited about this work that want to connect with other like-minded people.
Yeah, so conferences, trainings, events like this. Mm-hmm. I'm curious about, how do you take care of yourself as a therapist after a big and intensive psychedelic therapy session with the patient? Was it difficult at first?
Yeah. Kind of always poo-pooed like self-care, but we are so permeable to the energetic field in a psychedelic therapy session. So I've drawn some practices from a colleague and friend named Jenny Kundari. She taught me to go in the shower and have a little bottle of essential oils, usually from a tree. You pour a little in your hand, you can just put it on your body. And just like the trees, they know how to release toxins from their bodies. So it's a little bit of a practice that I do that I find really nourishing and delightful.
Mm-hmm. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. It's definitely been a journey, especially after the longer 8-hour MDMA sessions, which I was doing through the MAPS research. It's a lot of time to be in a room with someone. As much as you may feel connected and be doing powerful work, it's draining by the end. And so it is important to have practices that support you. Yeah, water, like baths, I find incredibly helpful. Moving, walking in the woods is one of my favorite things. Sometimes just, kind of stepping out of the room for a moment and stretching or shaking it off. And also a debriefing with colleagues, with consultants and with your co-therapist if you have one. Yeah, I also just grounding practices in the room, because on the one hand, while it can be depleting, especially the shorter ketamine sessions, I find can be nourishing. They're both are nourishing. And the more I can really practice being present in my body, in the space, like kind of meditate through the moments of silence, the less I feel depleted afterwards.
Yeah. So adding to the post-care and the care during the session, I would add the care before. So I make sure that I sleep well, that I eat well, that I know I'm going into work the next day and I am starting the day in the best conditions that I can. And then throughout the day, attention to the body, to the breath, to movement. And then at the end of the day, all the practices to release and discharge and rejuvenate. So you have been a fantastic audience. Thank you.
Yes, I would love to do that.
Sure.
Yeah,
Okay, so how about you call them and they stand up?
Okay, so we've got Jackie Hull right there. And honestly, I don't know if I have seen everyone yet. We've got Veronica Gold over here. So Veronica wrote on a somatic approach to psychedelic assisted therapy. Jackie wrote on a relational somatic approach to touch in psychedelic assisted therapy. Eric Sinknick was here earlier. I think he had to leave, but he wrote about music. And then we have a few people who are joining us virtually, including Karen Peoples, who wrote about mystical experiences, including Evan Sola, who co-authored the chapter with Jason on depth psychotherapy. Anyone I'm missing? I did not see. There may be others, honestly, on the virtual that I don't know are here. Thanks for your question.
Okay, we're not supposed to take questions right now, but sure, go ahead.
That exists between the Western approaches to experience and integration just in terms of group settings and settings that traditionally are more into towards nature and ground nature. How do you see that? I mentioned that
you really just called in some of the major pieces that we didn't get to today. So thank you for that. Let's see if we can touch on those briefly. Maybe I'll talk about groups and you can talk about integration. Integration is a giant topic, but it's a nice way to kind of end our time together today. In terms of groups, I just want to say that I think that group psychedelic therapy could be an incredibly healing and different type of modality to the individual work, in that we in Western culture are so isolated. There is not enough opportunity for for people to come together in community and just be together, much less heal. And so there are some beautiful models of community healing already out there, in everything from some of the more indigenous traditional practices like ayahuasca circles, to some of the decriminalized movements that are happening and bringing groups together, and also some psychedelic clinics that are offering group psychedelic therapy. But yeah, it's not just an internal process, but it also becomes a process of feeling connected to a larger whole and feeling a sense of belonging and learning that you can share these most vulnerable parts of yourself and be seen in them, and learning that you're not alone in the things that you suffer and struggle with. So yeah, I just think there's so much value there, and I look forward to seeing the ways that the field develops in that way. And yeah, Christopher and Brian Anderson, who both have significant experience holding psychedelic therapy groups in research settings, talk about these things in a really beautiful way in the book.
I'll be very brief because I know we're past time. The final chapter in the book is called The Upside of Coming Down. And it's written by Harvey Schwartz, Dr. Harvey Schwartz and Dr. Jessica Katzman, two local and very exquisitely talented psychedelic therapists. So one of their primary points is that healing is not a linear process, that the integration process does not look like a steady march towards health, that there's zigzagging, where the old habits of the psyche and the body come back, oftentimes with a vengeance, to assert familiarity in the face of the novelty that's just occurred in the experience. So knowing that that's a part of the integration and it's not a failure of the treatment, it's an opportunity to take the more expanded possibilities that came up, say in the medicine session, and bring them into relationship with the old parts that are very reluctant to let go. They're doing their job of maintaining stability. And so the two can alchemize each other. That's integration. Another key part of integration is that sometimes people can have what Jessica Katzman calls therapeutic bends, drawing from the metaphor of coming up too quickly from scuba diving. Suddenly your symptoms are in remission. And what kind of world are you living in now? It's, again, unfamiliar and can be quite scary, and again, create the propensity towards regression. The last thing I'll say is around community and relationship, having people in your life that can hold the kind of new fledgling states and to incubate them relationally, and to shine that light of mirroring back to you so that you can access those states when life stressors continue to come up and again press you back into the familiar. So this is where having beloved community is just really, really central to integration.
Thank you. It was my pleasure to be here tonight, Jason, with you and Genesee. Thank you for all your work, for being pioneers in this field, for supporting people in this path, in training and holding sessions, in teaching, for all your engagements throughout all these years. May it all pay back. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for this beautiful book. That's your first baby. And thank you, the audience, for your kind attention and participation. May you all get home safely under the light of the full moon until we meet again. Bye-bye.